The weight of the octuplets dragged at her spine with every step, her balance thrown by a belly too heavy for how far along she should have been. Wolf gestation mocking any human timeline she might have used to measure her own strength. Branches tore at her arms. Her lungs burned. Somewhere behind her, torches swayed among the trees, closer with every labored breath she managed to steal. Rosalind had been humiliated and driven out as though being the mother of the Alpha King's octuplets counted for less than nothing, as though carrying 8 lives beneath her heart were nothing more than an inconvenience to be discarded before it became a larger problem. When she felt she couldn't move another step, the cave mouth appeared out of nowhere, a black seam in the rock, barely wide enough for her shoulders, for her belly. Rosalind didn't think. She forced herself inside, scraping skin raw against stone, and collapsed into the cold dark just as the first torch swept past the entrance, close enough that she heard boots stop mere feet away. She pressed both hands over her own mouth and did not breathe. It was then she heard it. Not the men, not the wind, but a closer sound, coming from somewhere within the darkness itself. Heavy footsteps, a faint lantern light swaying in the distance, and, a moment later, the dull echo of a hammer striking stone, once, twice, 3 times, until a section of wall gave way with a muffled crash, revealing, impossibly, a golden glow coming from somewhere deep inside the mountain itself. She didn't know, huddled there with 8 small hearts pounding frantically beneath her palms, that the wall concealed far more than stone, that somewhere ahead, in the dark, an entire house waited, patient and forgotten for centuries, for exactly a woman like her to finally find it. She only knew she had to survive that hour, and the next, whatever it cost her. If you love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories, and you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. The dark inside the cave was absolute, the kind that pressed against the eyes until they invented shapes just to have something to focus on, and Rosalind stood perfectly still. One hand braced against damp stone, the other pressed flat to the enormous curve of her belly, counting breaths the way the old midwife back home had taught her. In for 4. Out for 4. Your body knows what to do. Her body currently disagreed rather strongly with that particular philosophy, given that it was carrying 8 wolf pups at 34 weeks, and had just been asked to run half a mile uphill through underbrush while being hunted by a dozen armed men. Outside, torchlight swept past the cave mouth. Close. Too close. Close enough that she heard one of Rennick's men mutter something about wasted effort and turning back before the storm hit. Keep walking, she thought at them fiercely. Keep walking, keep walking, keep... The torchlight receded. Boots crunched away through frozen brush, growing fainter, until the only sound left was her own ragged breathing, and somewhere deep beneath her palms, 8 small, furious heartbeats that had no intention of settling down anytime soon. "All right," she whispered, mostly to them, mostly to keep from screaming into the dark from sheer exhausted terror. "All right, we're alive. That's a start." One of them kicked, hard, directly beneath her ribs. She'd started thinking of that one as Thistle, because he objected to everything with the particular stubbornness of something that fully intended to argue about it later. "I know," she murmured. "I agree, it's a poor start. We'll aim higher tomorrow." 12 hours earlier, she had still believed Orin would come for her. 12 hours earlier, she had been in her rooms at Kestrel Keep, watching frost creep across the window pane, half listening to the muffled sound of Rennick's voice through the wall. A familiar low murmur she'd learned, over 2 years, to recognize as plotting long before she understood what, exactly, he plotted. "The council won't accept 8 marked heirs from a woman with no pack standing," Rennick had said, and she'd pressed closer to the wall without quite meaning to. "Not while Orin's away at the northern border. This is the only window we'll have. And the woman herself. A second voice, unfamiliar, flat, and businesslike. Gone by morning, one way or another. A pause, and then almost bored. She's too much trouble to keep. She hadn't waited to hear anything more. She'd been moving within minutes, out the window, down the old servant's stair Oren had shown her once, laughing, in a version of their life that felt impossibly distant now, and running through the frozen forest before Rennick's men had even finished readying their horses. She didn't know where Oren was exactly. Somewhere at the northern border, settling a dispute that had called him away 3 days earlier, promising he'd return before her time came. She didn't know if word had reached him yet that his brother intended to make sure there was nothing left to return to. She only knew she had to survive until he did. The cave, once her eyes adjusted, proved deeper than she'd expected. A narrow throat of rock opening, gradually into something wider, the air inside noticeably warmer than the biting cold outside, carrying a faint mineral smell she couldn't quite place. "Well," she said aloud, mostly for the comfort of her own voice in the dark. "At least it's not actively trying to kill us. That's an improvement over the last several hours." She'd taken perhaps 10 more careful steps, one hand trailing the wall for guidance, when her foot caught on something that was decidedly not natural stone. She crouched, wincing at the awkward angle her belly demanded, and ran her fingers over the obstruction. Smooth, curved, deliberately shaped. A worked stone. Placed, not fallen. "That's interesting," she murmured. "That's very interesting, and I have absolutely no way to investigate it properly in complete darkness, which feels like a design flaw in this entire evening." A contraction rolled through her then, not the sharp warning kind she'd felt twice already that night, but something closer to a deep, insistent pressure, gone as quickly as it arrived. "Not yet," she told her belly firmly, as if negotiation had ever once worked on 8 unborn wolves. "I need you all to hold on a little longer. I promise I'll make it worth your while." It was the light that saved her. A thin, wavering gleam from somewhere deeper in the cave, moving with the particular rhythm of a hand-carried lantern. "Who's there?" a voice called, gruff and entirely unbothered by the possibility of danger. "And why are you talking to your own stomach like it owes you money?" Rosalind froze, torn between relief at the sound of another living voice and wariness after a night that had taught her thoroughly not to trust strangers. "I'm not dangerous," she said carefully. "I'm just very pregnant and being hunted and possibly lost inside a mountain. It's been an eventful night." The lantern light drew closer, and the man who emerged from the dark was old, weathered, built like someone who'd spent decades doing honest, difficult work with his hands. A heavy hammer slung over one shoulder, soot smudged across a face that regarded her with more curiosity than alarm. "Hunted," he repeated, raising one bushy eyebrow. "By who, exactly?" "Lord Rennick, his men. It's a long story, and I'd rather not tell it standing up if there's an alternative available." The old man studied her a long moment, her torn dress, her exhaustion, the unmistakable weight of her pregnancy, and something in his weathered face shifted from suspicion into a kind of gruff, immediate protectiveness. "Gideon," he said by way of introduction. "I've lived in this mountain longer than most people remember it has a name. And I'll tell you plainly, girl, anyone Lord Rennick's hunting is automatically someone I'm inclined to help, purely on principle. Man tried to tax my forge 3 separate times, never forgave him for it. That's a remarkably petty reason to help a pregnant stranger. I contain multitudes," Gideon said, entirely unbothered, and something in the dry delivery pulled a startled, exhausted laugh out of her despite everything. "Now, what's this obstruction you were investigating before I interrupted your conversation with your own belly?" He knelt, examining the worked stone she'd found with the practiced attention of someone who understood rock and craftsmanship far better than most, running weathered fingers along a seam she hadn't even noticed. Huh, he said. Now that's interesting. That's what I said, actually. Great minds. He straightened, hefting his hammer with the easy familiarity of a man who'd used it every day for 50 years. This isn't natural stone. This is a door, girl. Old one. Sealed shut so long it's near fused to the rock around it. A door to what? Only one way to find out. He gave her a considering look. You able to stand back a moment? This is going to be loud, and I'd rather not startle whatever's currently occupying your belly into arriving early. They've been trying to arrive early all night. I don't think a hammer will make much difference at this point. Gideon huffed something that might have been amusement and swung. The first blow rang out through the cave like a struck bell, stone cracking along the seam Rosalind had felt but couldn't see. The second blow widened it. By the fourth, a section of wall gave way entirely, tumbling inward with a grinding crash that sent dust billowing into the lantern light. And beyond it, impossibly, warm golden light spilled out, steady and unflickering, illuminating something that made both of them go very still. Not a cave chamber. A room, carved deliberately, walls smooth and worked, furnished with furniture gone dusty with age but otherwise intact, a hearth cold but clearly usable, and at the center of it all, a low stone pedestal bearing a symbol Rosalind didn't recognize, glowing faint and gold even without any visible flame to explain it. That, Gideon said slowly, is not something I've encountered in 50 years living in this mountain. That's deeply reassuring. I didn't say it was dangerous. I said it was new. He stepped through the broken doorway cautiously, lantern raised, and Rosalind followed, one hand pressed protectively to her belly, curiosity warring with the bone-deep exhaustion of a night that refused to end simply. The room was warm, genuinely warm, despite the winter cold outside, despite no visible fire. And the moment Rosalind crossed the threshold, something in the glowing symbol on the pedestal flared brighter, pulsing once, twice, in a rhythm that felt, unsettlingly, almost like a heartbeat. It's reacting to you, Gideon said, watching closely. That's even less reassuring than the first thing. Another contraction rolled through her then, sharper this time, and Rosalind gripped the nearest wall for support, breath hissing through her teeth. Easy, Gideon said, suddenly all business, the gruff curiosity replaced instantly with practical urgency. How close are you exactly? Close enough that I'd rather not find out what happens if this symbol keeps glowing brighter every time I have a contraction. Fair point. Gideon set his hammer down, surveying the room with a craftsman's quick assessment. This chamber's sound, dry, defensible, and considerably warmer than that cave mouth you stumbled through. Whatever magic's humming in that stone, it's not hurting you, and right now that's the only qualification that matters. You're not walking back out into the cold tonight, not in your condition. You're offering to let a stranger have her pups in your secret mountain chamber. I'm offering to let a stranger not die of exposure in my secret mountain chamber, which felt like the more pressing concern. Gideon was already moving, pulling dusty but serviceable blankets from an old chest against the wall, shaking them out with brisk efficiency. Besides, anyone Rennick wants dead badly enough to hunt through a mountain at midnight is exactly the kind of trouble I've been waiting 50 years to be part of. Rosalind lowered herself carefully onto the blankets he arranged, exhaustion finally catching up to her all at once, the golden pulse of the strange symbol casting warm light across the ancient room. Thank you, she said quietly, for not asking more questions than you needed to. Questions can wait for morning, Gideon said, settling nearby with the particular patient readiness of a man prepared to keep watch all night if necessary. Rest now, girl. Whatever's coming, Rennick's men, those 8 pups, whatever this glowing rock intends to do about either, it'll still be there when you wake. No sense meeting it exhausted. Outside, beyond the broken doorway, the storm Rennick's men had mentioned finally broke in full, wind howling against the mountainside. And somewhere far to the north, King Orin Kestrel woke from a restless sleep, with his chest aching and no explanation for why. Only the sudden, overwhelming certainty that something he loved was in terrible danger, and that he was, for the first time in 2 years, entirely too far away to help. Morning arrived without any actual sunlight to announce it. Only the golden pulse of the strange pedestal, steady and patient, and the smell of something Gideon was cooking over a small fire he'd somehow coaxed to life in the ancient hearth. "You have provisions," Rosalind observed, watching him stir a pot with the easy competence of a man who'd clearly cooked over open flame more times than he could count. "I have provisions because I live in a mountain, girl, not because I predicted I'd be feeding a fugitive expecting 8 pups." Gideon handed her a bowl of something that smelled, improbably, like actual stew. "Eat. You're feeding a small army in there, and I won't have you fainting on my ancient magical floor before I've had a chance to properly investigate it." "Is that your primary concern? The floor?" "My primary concern is you and those 8 pups. The floor is simply where I'm choosing to direct my nervous energy about it." He settled across from her, examining the glowing pedestal with open curiosity. "You said Rennick called them a monster's litter. That true, in your experience? 8 pups is a great deal, even for shifter stock. Orin didn't think so." Something in her chest ached, saying his name aloud after a night spent running from everything he wasn't there to protect her from. "He said—" She stopped, throat tight. "Take your time," Gideon said, gently for a man whose default setting seemed to be gruff. "I've got nowhere else to be. 50 years in a mountain teaches a man patience, if nothing else." She told him slowly, between spoonfuls of stew, about the night she'd told Orin she was carrying. Not 1 pup, which would have been ordinary, not even 2 or 3, which would have been remarkable but manageable. But 8, confirmed by the pack physician with an expression of barely concealed astonishment. "He didn't flinch," she said quietly. "Not once. I watched his face the entire time, waiting for the moment it would become too much, too strange, too impossible, too far outside anything either of us had planned for. It never came. 8, Orin had said, and something in his voice had cracked wide open with wonder rather than fear. 8, Rosalind. Do you understand what that means? No wolf line in 3 centuries has carried that many. The old texts call litters that large a mark of—" He'd stopped himself, laughing, pressing his forehead to hers. "I don't even care what the old texts call it. I only care that it's ours, that you're carrying something no one predicted, no one planned for, entirely out of nowhere. The same way you arrived in my life, honestly." He proposed that same night, she told Gideon, a small, unsteady smile finding its way onto her face despite everything. Badly. Very badly, actually. He'd apparently been planning something elaborate for months, and instead he simply blurted it out mid-sentence, completely unprepared, kneeling in his boots with mud still on them from the training yard. Romantic. Catastrophically unromantic. I said yes anyway. Sounds like the kind of unromantic that actually means something, Gideon observed. The elaborate ones usually mean a man's been rehearsing more than feeling. Rosalind considered that, turning her empty bowl over in her hands. He said I made him laugh in rooms where laughing wasn't allowed. Council meetings, mostly. I have a talent for finding the absurd thing everyone else is too polite to mention. I've noticed that talent myself, in our short acquaintance. It's gotten me in considerable trouble over the years. Most useful talents do. Gideon refilled her bowl without asking, the particular gruff hospitality of a man uncomfortable expressing care directly, but entirely willing to express it through stew. Rennick, then. What's his stake in all this, beyond simple cruelty? Men like that usually have a story underneath the villainy, even if it's not one that excuses it. Rosalind was quiet a long moment, considering the question with more fairness than she felt Rennick had earned. He was Orin's father's favorite once, she said finally. Before Orin was born. Rennick's mother was the first wife, died young, before Oren's mother came along. For years, everyone assumed Rennick would inherit. Then Oren arrived, marked from birth with the kind of strength the pack elders had been waiting generations for, and Rennick simply stopped being the plan. That'd curdle a man's affection for his own brother, I imagine. I think it did, slowly, over years. I don't think he was born cruel. I think he was raised to expect a throne, and then watched it get handed to someone else through no fault or effort of his own, and never found a way to make peace with that. She frowned, turning the thought over. That doesn't excuse hunting a pregnant woman through a frozen forest. But I understand, a little, why a man convinces himself something monstrous is actually justice. You're remarkably generous toward a man who tried to have you killed. I've had a great deal of time to think about it, apparently, while running for my life. A tired, wry smile. Besides, I'd rather understand my enemies than simply hate them blindly. Hatred's exhausting, and I've got 8 pups worth of energy to conserve for more useful purposes. Gideon studied her with something that looked, beneath his usual gruffness, like genuine respect. You're an unusual woman, Rosalind. I contain multitudes, she said, echoing his own words back at him, and was rewarded with an actual startled laugh. Short, rough, entirely unpracticed, the sound of a man who clearly hadn't laughed properly in longer than he'd admit. 3 days' ride north, King Oren Kestrel stood in the war tent that had housed the border negotiations, staring at a folded letter that had arrived by messenger hawk an hour earlier, his hands gone white-knuckled around the parchment. Your Majesty, Lady Rosalind has left the castle under circumstances Lord Rennick describes as voluntary departure amid personal difficulty. No further explanation offered. Her rooms were found empty at dawn. Voluntary departure, Oren repeated, low and dangerous, to the empty tent. 5 months pregnant with 8 pups, and my brother's calling it voluntary departure. His second in command, a broad, steady woman named Captain Wren Ashford. No relation to anyone of note, as she liked to remind people, purely to avoid confusion with certain noble lines, entered at the sound of his voice and went very still at whatever she read on his face. Sire? Rosalind's gone. Rennick's calling it voluntary. Oren's jaw worked, fury and terror tangled together so completely he couldn't separate them anymore. She wouldn't leave voluntarily. Not 5 months along, not without word to me first. Something's wrong. You think Lord Rennick? I think my brother has spent 2 years finding increasingly creative ways to make his objections to my marriage known. And I think a woman carrying 8 heirs he's called unnatural in council meetings more than once, going missing the moment I'm 3 days' ride away, is not a coincidence I'm willing to entertain. Wren's expression hardened into something grimly practical. Orders, sire? We ride within the hour. Full contingent. Oren was already moving, already shouting for his horse, already abandoning 3 days of careful negotiation without a second thought. Whatever's happening at Kestrel Keep, I intend to be there before it finishes happening. The ride back passed in a blur of frozen roads and mounting dread, Oren's mind circling the same worn groove over and over. Every argument he and Rosalind had ever had with Rennick present, every carefully worded objection about pack standing and council precedent that had, in hindsight, sounded considerably more sinister than he'd allowed himself to notice at the time. You're thinking too loudly, Wren observed, riding alongside him on the second day, her tone carrying the particular blunt familiarity of someone who'd served him long enough to speak plainly. I can practically hear it from here. I should have noticed sooner. Rennick's been building toward something for months, and I told myself it was simple sibling resentment. Manageable. Something that would ease with time. You're a king fighting border disputes, not a mind reader. You can't be blamed for not predicting your own brother's willingness to move against a pregnant woman. I can be blamed for not protecting her better regardless. His hands tightened on the reins. She used to tease me, you know. about taking things too seriously. She'd catch me brooding over some minor council dispute and simply start laughing, right in the middle of it, completely unbothered by whatever gravity I was trying to maintain. Told me once that a king who couldn't laugh at himself occasionally was destined to become exactly the kind of tyrant the old stories warned about. Sounds like a wise woman. The wisest I've known, and the most maddening. She once interrupted an entire council session about grain tariffs to point out that Elder Voss had spinach in his teeth throughout the whole proceeding, and none of us had said anything for fear of the protocol violation. A ghost of a smile crossed his exhausted face, quickly swallowed by fresh worry. I fell in love with her somewhere around that exact moment, honestly. Watching an entire room of powerful, self-important men collectively decide that spinach mattered more than politics for one full minute. That's a fairly specific moment to fall in love in. She has a talent for finding the absurd thing everyone else is too polite to mention. It's rather difficult not to fall for someone who refuses to take pompous ceremony as seriously as it insists on taking itself. They reached Kestrel Keep on the 4th day to find Rennick waiting in the courtyard, composed and carefully arranged, an expression of practiced concern already fixed on his face. "Brother," Rennick said, bowing with precise, correct formality. "I'm relieved you've returned. We've been searching for Lady Rosalind since her disappearance, though I confess the trail's gone cold." "Searching?" Oren repeated flat. "With how many men exactly?" "A dozen initially. The storm hampered our efforts considerably." A dozen men searching for a missing pregnant woman, and yet not a single one thought to send word to me until she'd already been gone a full day. Oren's voice had gone low and dangerous, the particular controlled fury of a man holding himself back through sheer effort of will. "That seems like a curious oversight, brother." Something flickered behind Rennick's careful composure, not quite guilt, but close enough to its neighborhood, there and quickly smoothed over. "I didn't want to alarm you unnecessarily before we'd exhausted the obvious possibilities," Rennick said. "She may simply have grown overwhelmed. The pregnancy, the pressure of expectation, the council's continued objections, women in her condition sometimes—" "Do not," Oren cut in, voice like ice. "Finish that sentence with anything that suggests Rosalind is the kind of woman who runs from difficulty rather than through it. I've known her 2 years. I've watched her face down council elders twice her age without flinching. She does not simply grow overwhelmed and vanish into a winter storm." Rennick's jaw tightened, and for one unguarded moment, something raw showed beneath the careful performance. Not triumph, but a kind of cornered, defensive resentment that had clearly been building far longer than the past 4 days. "I've spent my whole life being told what I was owed, and then watching it handed elsewhere," Rennick said, quieter now, almost to himself. "I never once asked for that woman to be part of the plan, and yet somehow her absence is treated as though I've personally engineered a tragedy." "Have you?" Oren's voice was very quiet now, very controlled, and somehow more frightening for it. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Ren's hand drifted instinctively toward her sword. "I don't know where she is," Rennick said finally. And there was something almost true in the careful precision of the phrasing. A man choosing his words exactly enough to avoid an outright lie, while still concealing everything that mattered. "I know only that her absence solves a problem the council has been quietly wringing its hands over for months. Whether that solution required my direct involvement, or whether the universe simply arranged matters conveniently on its own, I couldn't say with certainty. That is not an answer. It's the only one I'm prepared to give you today." Rennick met his brother's eyes, something almost like challenge in it, tangled up with an old, unresolved grief neither of them had ever properly addressed. "You've spent 2 years building a life I was raised to believe belonged to me by right. I won't pretend I've made peace with watching it happen. I will say, for whatever it's worth to you now, that I never intended actual harm, only removal. A complication resolved, not a person destroyed. Those are not different outcomes if she's dead in a frozen forest somewhere, Rennick." Something in Rennick's composure finally cracked at that. A flash of genuine, unrehearsed fear crossing his face, quickly suppressed but not quickly enough for Oren to miss it entirely. "I never wanted her dead," Rennick said, low and strained. "I wanted her gone. There's a considerable difference, whatever you believe of me right now." Oren studied his brother for a long, silent moment. The man who'd once taught him to ride, decades ago, before resentment had curdled everything between them into something neither had found the courage to properly name, and found, beneath his own fury, an old and complicated grief of his own. "Find her," Oren said finally, voice rough. "Whatever men you have left searching, whatever resources this castle can spare. If she's alive out there, in that storm, 5 months pregnant and alone, I want her found before the cold finishes what your ambition started." He turned without waiting for a response, already calling for fresh horses, already preparing to ride back out into the same frozen forest his brother's careful cruelty had driven her into. Unaware, as he mounted, exactly how close Rosalind already was, sheltered warm and safe inside an ancient mountain chamber, protected by an old hermit's stubborn kindness and a pulsing golden light that had, somehow, already begun to recognize her as something worth keeping. By the 3rd day in the mountain chamber, Rosalind had developed a working theory about the glowing pedestal, based entirely on careful observation and Gideon's 50 years of accumulated, if unsystematic, mountain lore. "It brightens when I'm near it," she said, watching the golden symbol pulse steady as she settled onto the blankets Gideon had arranged into something resembling proper bedding. "And it brightened considerably more the first night, when I was frightened and exhausted. I think it's responding to something. Emotion, maybe. Or the pups." "Could be both," Gideon said, stirring another pot of something that smelled, this time, encouragingly like actual bread, rather than mysterious stew. "Old magic doesn't always separate those two things as neatly as we'd like. Fear and new life aren't so different if you think on it long enough. Both urgent. Both demanding attention." "That's unexpectedly poetic, for a man who threatened to feed a tax collector to a goat." "I never said I threatened a goat specifically. I said I have opinions about tax collectors that I've expressed historically with considerable creativity." "That's not actually a denial." "I contain multitudes," Gideon said again, and Rosalind found herself laughing properly for what felt like the first time in days. A real laugh, warm and unguarded. The kind that eased something tight in her chest she hadn't fully realized she was carrying. It was on the 4th day that the pedestal did something entirely new. Rosalind had been sitting near it, one hand resting on the smooth stone edge out of idle curiosity more than any real expectation, when the golden light flared suddenly bright enough to fill the entire chamber, and a low hum, felt more than heard, vibrating up through her palm and into her chest, settled into a rhythm that matched unmistakably her own racing heartbeat. "Gideon," she said, voice tight. He was beside her in seconds, hammer already in hand out of pure reflex, though there was nothing here to strike. Nothing threatening about the warm light spreading now across her skin like sunlight through water. "It's not hurting me," she said quickly, feeling him tense to intervene. I don't know what it's doing, exactly, but it doesn't hurt." The light traced up her arm, settled briefly over her belly with a warmth that made all 8 pups shift at once. A full-body ripple of movement she felt clearly for the first time, distinct enough that she gasped, one hand flying to press against the sensation. "They felt that," she said, half laughing, half overwhelmed. "They actually felt that." Gideon watched, weathered face caught somewhere between wonder and wariness, as the golden light gradually settled, dimming back to its steady pulse, leaving behind a faint warmth against her skin that lingered long after the brightness faded. "Well," he said finally, "I've lived in this mountain 50 years and I've genuinely never seen anything like that. Is that good news or bad news? Undetermined currently. But I'll say this much. Whatever that pedestal is, it's decided you and those 8 pups matter to it. And in my experience, old magic doesn't waste that kind of attention on things it intends to harm. That night, unable to sleep despite exhaustion pulling at every muscle, Rosalind found herself telling Gideon more than she'd intended, not just about Oren's proposal, badly delivered on muddy knees, but about the quieter moments that had built, slowly, into something she still struggled to believe was real. "He used to sneak into the kitchens," she said, smiling at the memory despite everything. "Middle of the night, completely undignified for a king, just to steal bread and cheese and sit with me on the floor because the kitchen was the only room in that entire castle that didn't feel like it belonged to ceremony. Sounds like a man who understood what actually mattered. He'd complain, constantly, about council meetings. Not the substance, usually, but the theater of it. The performed seriousness. He said once that half the elders had forgotten they were actually solving problems, not simply performing the appearance of solving problems for each other's benefit." She laughed softly. "I told him that was exactly the kind of thing that would get him labeled a difficult king by historians someday, and he said he'd rather be difficult and honest than easy and hollow. That's a fine philosophy for a ruler. It got him in trouble more than once. Rennick used it against him repeatedly, said Oren's informality undermined the crown's dignity, that a king who ate cheese on kitchen floors with his lover invited disrespect from the council." Something tightened in her chest, saying it aloud. I always wondered if that resentment ran deeper than simple political disagreement. If Rennick genuinely believed the throne demanded a colder, more distant kind of king, the kind he might have become himself, had things gone differently. You keep circling back to understanding him. Rennick, I mean. I can't seem to help it. Hatred requires a kind of energy I don't have much spare of right now, carrying 8 lives and running from armed men. Understanding, at least, doesn't cost me anything extra. She pressed a hand to her belly, feeling Thistle's now familiar, restless shifting beneath her palm. Besides, I keep thinking, if Oren and I are lucky enough that these pups survive, grow up, inherit whatever kingdom's left after all this, I don't want them raised believing the world is only villains and heroes. People are more complicated than that, even the ones who've hurt us. Gideon was quiet a long moment, something thoughtful in his weathered expression. You'd have made a fine philosopher in another life. I'll settle for surviving this one first, honestly. The search parties reached the base of the mountain on the 6th day, Oren himself leading the largest contingent, his exhaustion visible in every line of his face after days of relentless, increasingly desperate searching. Nothing, Captain Wren reported grimly, returning from the eastern ridge with her own search team. No tracks, no sign, nothing the storm hasn't already erased. She's alive, Oren said, low and certain, the particular stubborn conviction of a man refusing to entertain any alternative. I'd know. I'd feel it somehow if she weren't. Sire. I'd know, Wren. His voice cracked slightly on the words, exhaustion and fear finally showing through the careful royal composure he'd maintained for 6 brutal days. She's out here somewhere, alive. I have to believe that, because the alternative isn't something I can carry and still function. Wren studied him a long moment, something gentling in her usually brisk expression. Then we keep looking. Every ridge, every cave, every inch of this mountain if that's what it takes. They'd been searching the base of the mountain for another hour, methodical and increasingly desperate, when one of the younger guards called out from a narrow rock formation nearly hidden by overgrown brush. Sire! There's an opening here. Looks like it might lead somewhere. Oren was there in seconds, examining the narrow cave mouth with hands that shook slightly from more than just the cold. It's wide enough for someone to fit through. Barely. Wide enough for a heavily pregnant woman? Wren asked carefully. If she was desperate enough, yes. Oren was already moving, torch raised, voice tight with fresh, cautious hope. Rosalind, Rosalind, if you're in here, please, answer me. Deep in the mountain chamber, Rosalind's head snapped up at the sound. Distant, muffled through stone, but unmistakably, impossibly familiar. Gideon, she breathed. That's... I heard it too. Gideon was already moving toward the broken doorway, hammer in hand out of pure protective instinct. Could be a trick. Rennick's men trying to draw you out with a voice similar enough to fool you. It's not similar enough. It's exactly him. Rosalind was on her feet despite the ache in her back, despite the awkward weight of her belly, moving toward the sound with a hope she barely dared trust. Oren! Oren, I'm here! I'm in here! The sound of footsteps, running now, echoing through the narrow cave passage, and then Oren's torchlight spilled into the chamber, and the man himself appeared in the broken doorway, breathless, filthy from 6 days of desperate searching, and utterly, completely undone at the sight of her standing there, alive, whole. One hand pressed protectively to the unmistakable curve of her belly. Rosalind. Her name broke apart in his mouth, all royal composure abandoned entirely, and he crossed the chamber in 3 strides, pulling her into arms that shook with 6 days of accumulated terror, finally releasing all at once. I'm all right, she said, muffled against his chest, feeling her own tears finally spill over now that the danger had actually passed. We're all right, all of us. I thought... His voice broke entirely, and he pulled back just enough to look at her properly, hands framing her face with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the desperate strength of his grip a moment before. 6 days, Rosalind. 6 days not knowing if you were alive, if the pups were safe, if my own brother had... He stopped himself, jaw tight with fresh fury. He didn't catch me, she said gently. I ran. I found this cave, and then I found Gideon, and then we found this entire hidden chamber that's apparently been reacting to me and the pups in ways neither of us fully understand yet. Oren's gaze finally shifted past her, taking in the ancient room properly for the first time. The glowing pedestal, the dusty but intact furniture, the old hermit standing watchfully nearby with his hammer still in hand. You're the one who found her, Oren said, something raw and grateful in his voice. Found her stumbling around in the dark, more precisely, Gideon said, entirely unbothered by addressing a king directly. She found the door herself. I just happened to have a hammer handy when it needed opening. Whatever your role in it, you have my gratitude, genuinely. Whatever you need, whatever this mountain requires, the crown will provide it. I require considerably less gratitude and considerably more information about what exactly this glowing rock intends to do long-term, Gideon said dryly. It's been humming at your lady rather insistently these past few days, and I'd like to understand why before I hand her back over to castle life without a proper explanation. Oren knelt beside the pedestal, examining the golden symbol with careful attention, something shifting in his expression as recognition dawned. I know this mark, he said slowly. It's old. Older than the current line, older than most recorded history. The pack elders speak of it sometimes, in stories meant more as legend than fact. A sanctuary mark, meant to recognize and protect a bloodline destined for something significant. I never believed it was more than folklore. Folklore doesn't usually glow and hum against your ribs, Rosalind said. No, Oren agreed, something wondering entering his voice. It doesn't. He looked at her belly, at the 8 lives sheltered beneath her hands, and something in his exhausted face softened into pure, unguarded awe. 8 pups, marked by an ancient sanctuary sign no one alive has actually witnessed activate. I don't think that's coincidence, Rosalind. I think whatever's carried in this litter is exactly as significant as the old stories claimed it might be. Wonderful, Rosalind said, with the particular dry humor that had apparently survived 6 days of terror fully intact. As if being hunted by my own soon-to-be brother-in-law wasn't complicated enough, now we're apparently ancient prophecy as well. Despite everything, the exhaustion, the danger, the 6 days of desperate fear. Oren laughed, real and warm and entirely unguarded, pulling her close again with a tenderness that made the whole ancient chamber feel, suddenly, considerably less mysterious and considerably more like exactly where she was always meant to end up. "I missed that," he murmured against her hair. 6 days of searching, and what I missed most wasn't simply knowing you were safe. It was this, you, finding the absurd thing in the middle of genuine crisis, refusing to let any of it become too solemn to survive. "Someone has to keep this family from taking itself too seriously," Rosalind said. "Apparently that job falls to me, prophecy and glowing rocks notwithstanding." Behind them, Gideon cleared his throat loudly, entirely unbothered by interrupting the moment. "Touching reunion aside, I'd remind you both that Rennick's men are presumably still searching this mountain, and this chamber, however magical, doesn't have a second exit I've found yet. We should discuss actual logistics before getting too comfortable in the poetry of the moment." "He's right," Oren said reluctantly, pulling back just enough to look at her properly. "We need a plan. Getting you safely back to the keep, dealing with Rennick properly this time, understanding what this mark actually means before the council starts asking questions we can't yet answer." "After 6 days of running and hiding," Rosalind said, "I find I have considerable energy remaining for exactly that kind of plan. Let's go deal with your brother properly, Oren. I believe he and I have several things to discuss." The journey back to Kestrel Keep took 2 full days, slowed deliberately for Rosalind's sake, despite her repeated, increasingly creative protests that she was entirely capable of riding at normal pace. "I ran through a frozen forest 6 days ago," she pointed out for perhaps the 4th time, as their small procession wound carefully down the mountain's lower slopes. "I think I can survive a horse moving at something faster than a funeral procession." "You ran through a frozen forest and then spent 6 days in a cave with limited food and considerable stress," Oren said, riding close beside her with the particular hovering attentiveness she suspected would take him weeks to fully abandon. "Forgive me for preferring caution." "I'll allow the caution. I reserve the right to complain about it extensively." "Noted. I've grown rather fond of your complaints over the years. They're usually more entertaining than most council proceedings." Gideon, riding on Rosalind's other side with the deeply unimpressed expression of a mountain hermit forced into unexpected travel, made a small, disgruntled sound. "If either of you plans to continue this particular flavor of flirtation the entire way back, I'd like advance warning so I can arrange to ride considerably further ahead." "You're welcome to ride ahead now, Gideon." "And leave you two unsupervised to further embarrass yourselves? Absolutely not. Someone responsible needs to witness this properly, if only so there's a credible account when the pups eventually ask how their parents behaved during the crisis that apparently ended in extended flirting on horseback." Rosalind laughed, warm and unguarded, and caught Oren watching her with an expression of such open, undisguised affection that her own breath caught slightly in response. "What?" she asked. "Nothing. Just remembering how much I missed exactly that sound these past 6 days." He reached over, careful of the horse's pace, and took her hand. "I'd nearly convinced myself I'd never hear it again. I told you, someone has to keep this family from taking itself too seriously." "You've mentioned that job description before. I find myself increasingly grateful someone's willing to hold the position." Captain Wren rode ahead to alert the keep of their return, which meant that by the time their procession reached the castle gates, a considerable portion of the household staff had assembled to witness Rosalind's arrival, relief and open curiosity mixing visibly across dozens of faces. Among them, standing slightly apart from the gathered crowd, with an expression carefully arranged into something resembling composed relief, was Lord Rennick. "You found her," he said, and Rosalind noted, with the particular attention she'd developed over 2 years of studying him carefully, that his relief seemed genuine, complicated certainly, tangled with whatever guilt or resentment still lived beneath his careful surface, but genuine nonetheless. "No thanks to your search efforts," Oren said, voice cold, dismounting and immediately positioning himself protectively near Rosalind. "I've had 6 days to consider my own conduct, brother," Rennick said quietly. "I won't insult either of you by pretending my hands are entirely clean in this matter. I knew considerably more about the circumstances of her disappearance than I initially admitted." The courtyard went very quiet at that, the assembled staff exchanging uneasy glances. "You're confessing this publicly," Oren said slowly. "I'm confessing this because I've spent 6 days watching you tear this territory apart, searching for a woman I helped drive into a frozen forest, and I find I no longer have the stomach to maintain the careful deniability I'd constructed for myself." Rennick's composure cracked slightly, something raw showing through. "I arranged for her rooms to be left unguarded that night. I made certain word of my private conversation would reach her, one way or another, because some part of me, a part I'm not proud of, wanted her frightened enough to run, without my having to bear the weight of ordering anything more direct. That's not meaningfully different from ordering it directly, Rennick." "I know," Rennick said, quiet and raw. "I've had 6 days alone with that knowledge, brother. It's not been comfortable company." Rosalind studied him, this man who had orchestrated her flight into genuine danger, and found, to her own continued surprise, that hatred still refused to fully take hold, even now. Even standing in the courtyard he'd effectively exiled her from. "Why?" she asked simply. Not the political explanation, the real one, underneath it. Rennick looked at her for a long moment, something old and unresolved moving behind his careful composure. "Because for 30 years, I was raised to believe a throne belonged to me." Then Oren arrived, marked from birth with everything the pack elders had been waiting generations for, and I watched everything I'd been promised simply redirected, without anyone ever properly asking whether that redirection cost me something worth acknowledging. His jaw tightened. "And then you arrived, unmarked, unremarkable by any council standard, and Oren loved you so completely, so publicly, so without any of the careful political calculation a king's marriage is supposed to require, that it felt like watching the throne's dignity discarded entirely for something I couldn't understand, valuing that highly. You resented me for being loved without calculation. I resented you for having something I'd never once been permitted to want for myself," Rennick said, quiet and raw. "A choice, freely made, without the weight of legacy attached to it. I've spent my whole life being told what I owed the crown. I never once considered that Oren might simply want something for himself, without owing anyone an explanation for it." Something in Rosalind's chest ached at that. Not forgiveness, not yet. The wound was too fresh and the danger too real for that. But understanding, complicated and uncomfortable, settling into place regardless. "That's not nothing, Rennick," she said finally. "But it doesn't undo 6 days of genuine terror, or the danger you put 8 innocent lives in. Understanding your reasons and excusing your actions are different things." "I know," Rennick said. "I'm not asking for excuse. Only acknowledgement that whatever cruelty I enacted, it grew from somewhere real, even if I let it grow into something unforgivable in the process." Oren, who had been listening with visible, controlled fury, finally spoke. "You'll face formal judgment before the full council, Rennick. Whatever grief underlies your actions, you endangered a pregnant woman and 8 unborn heirs. That cannot simply be acknowledged and forgiven without consequence." "I expect nothing less," Rennick said. "I've already begun drafting my own formal confession for the council's record. I won't make you carry the burden of prosecuting me reluctantly, brother. I'll present the evidence against myself." Something in that admission seemed to genuinely surprise Oren, his controlled fury softening slightly into something more complicated. "That's Considerably more accountability than I expected from you. I've had 6 days to remember what kind of man I actually want to be, rather than the one grief and resentment slowly built without my full permission. Rennick's composure finally cracked entirely, something young and lost showing through the careful mask he'd maintained for years. I don't expect this to repair anything quickly. I only wanted you both to know I understand exactly what I nearly cost you, and I intend to spend considerable time earning back even the smallest measure of trust, if that's ever possible. That evening, settled finally in her own familiar rooms with a proper bath and actual rest ahead of her, Rosalind found Oren sitting quietly beside her, watching with the same open wonder he'd worn since finding her in the mountain chamber. "You're staring?" she observed. "I'm allowed to stare. I spent 6 days uncertain I'd ever see you again." "Fair point." She leaned into him, exhaustion finally catching up properly now that danger had genuinely passed. "What do you make of Rennick's confession? Truly?" "I don't know yet," Oren admitted. "I want to believe it's genuine. Some part of me remembers the brother who taught me to ride, decades ago, before all of this curdled between us, but I also watched him orchestrate real danger toward you and our pups, and I can't simply set that aside because he's finally found the courage to admit it. You don't have to choose between believing him and holding him accountable. Both things can be true. You keep saying that. About everyone lately. Rennick, the situation, even the ancient magic humming in that mountain chamber." He looked at her with something warm and slightly amazed. "How do you manage that? Holding complexity without collapsing it into something simpler?" "Practice, mostly. And considerable stubbornness about refusing to let the world be simpler than it actually is." She pressed a hand to her belly, feeling Thistle's familiar restless shifting. "Besides, I'm about to raise 8 children in a world that's rarely fair or simple. I'd rather teach them to hold complexity honestly than pretend everything sorts neatly into villains and heroes." Oren's hand joined hers against the curve of her belly, warm and steady. 4 more months, he said, quietly. 4 more months until we meet them properly. 4 more months of this belly getting even more enormous, apparently, if wolf gestation runs the way Gideon claims. I look forward to every increasingly enormous month of it, Oren said, and kissed her temple with a tenderness that made the whole exhausting day finally settle into something resembling peace. The formal council session convened 3 days later, the chamber filled with elders whose expressions ranged from open curiosity to carefully guarded suspicion, as Rennick stood at its center, delivering his own confession with a steadiness that surprised even those who knew him best. "I orchestrated circumstances that drove Lady Rosalind from this castle, 5 months pregnant, into genuine danger," he said, voice carrying clearly across the chamber. "I did so out of resentment I'd carried for decades regarding my own displaced inheritance, resentment I allowed to curdle into something I'm not proud of admitting to this council, or to my brother, or to the woman I nearly cost him." Elder Voss, an older council member whose reputation for stern skepticism preceded him considerably, leaned forward with sharp attention. "You understand, Lord Rennick, that this confession alone constitutes grounds for formal exile, at minimum." "I understand that fully," Rennick said. "I'm prepared to accept whatever judgment this council determines appropriate." Rosalind, seated beside Oren with her hands folded over her considerable belly, watched this exchange with the particular careful attention she'd developed over years of studying rooms full of powerful, self-important men. "May I speak?" she said, rising slightly, the movement drawing the entire chamber's attention. "Lady Rosalind," Elder Voss said, something cautious in his tone. "The council recognizes your right to address this matter, given your direct involvement. Lord Rennick endangered my life and the lives of 8 unborn heirs," Rosalind said, voice steady despite the weight of every eye in the chamber. "I won't pretend otherwise, or minimize what those 6 days cost me, physically and otherwise. But I've also spent considerable time this week considering what actually serves this territory best going forward. Punishment that satisfies anger, or accountability that might actually repair something broken. You're suggesting leniency, Elder Voss said, clearly skeptical. I'm suggesting nuance, Rosalind corrected. Formal exile removes Lord Rennick from any position to cause further harm, certainly. It also removes any possibility of him becoming someone genuinely useful to this territory, someone who might spend the coming years actively repairing the damage his resentment caused, rather than simply disappearing to nurse that resentment somewhere else, unsupervised and unaccountable. Rennick, watching her with visible surprise, said nothing, though something complicated moved across his careful expression. What alternative would you propose? Elder Voss asked. Formal removal from succession, certainly. He's forfeited any claim to influence over that matter permanently. But rather than exile, I'd propose supervised service. Rebuilding the northern border settlements that suffered during his search for me, direct oversight from the Crown, formal accountability reviewed by this council annually until trust is genuinely rebuilt, if it can be. She glanced at Oren. That's my recommendation for whatever weight it carries. The final decision belongs properly to the king and this council. The council deliberated for the better part of an hour, voices rising and falling in careful argument, while Rosalind sat quietly beside Oren, exhaustion pulling at her despite the importance of the proceedings. You didn't have to advocate for him, Oren murmured, low enough that only she could hear. I know. I chose to anyway. She met his eyes, something settled and certain in her expression. I don't want our children raised in a territory that only understands justice as punishment. I want them to understand it can also mean genuine repair, difficult as that path usually proves to be. You're a remarkable woman, Rosalind. I contain multitudes. We've established this extensively between myself and Gideon both. That earned a genuine warm laugh from Oren, momentarily easing the tension of the proceedings. And when the council finally rendered its verdict, supervised service in the Northern Territories, formal removal from succession, annual review before this same council, Rennick's visible relief was tangled unmistakably with something like genuine gratitude, directed, Rosalind noted, primarily toward her rather than toward his own brother. Thank you, he said quietly, once the session had formally concluded and the chamber had begun to empty. I don't deserve the mercy you argued for. I intend to spend considerable time earning it retroactively, regardless. See that you do, Rosalind said, not unkindly, one hand resting protectively over her belly. These pups will grow up hearing this story eventually, Rennick. I'd rather it end with you as a man who found his way back to honor, rather than one who simply disappeared into bitter exile. Make that version true if you're able. Rennick studied her a long moment, something young and genuinely moved beneath his careful composure. I intend to try, however long it takes. He left the chamber with his shoulders straighter than Rosalind had seen them in the 2 years she'd known him, and she found, watching him go, that the old ache where his resentment had once lived felt, finally, considerably quieter than before. Life at Kestrel Keep, in the weeks following the council's judgment, settled into a rhythm Rosalind hadn't quite believed she'd get to have. Ordinary mornings, ordinary meals, the particular unremarkable piece of a household no longer holding its breath. Gideon, to nobody's genuine surprise, had refused to return to his mountain solitude, citing an entirely unconvincing excuse about needing to properly supervise the pedestal's continued effects on Rosalind's pregnancy. You could simply admit you've grown fond of us, Rosalind said, watching him repair a hinge on the nursery door with the same practiced competence he'd once used to swing a hammer through solid rock. I admit no such thing. I'm here purely for scientific observation of an unprecedented magical phenomenon. The pedestal is in the mountain, Gideon. You're currently 3 days' ride from it, fixing door hinges. Preparatory research, he said, entirely unbothered. Understanding the environment the pups will inhabit is equally scientifically relevant. You've also started a garden in the eastern courtyard, entirely unprompted. Herbs, for medicinal purposes, extremely scientific. Rosalind laughed, settling into the chair Oren had insisted on having custom built once her belly had grown too unwieldy for ordinary seating, and found herself, not for the first time, deeply grateful that a hunted, terrified night in a cave had led her to exactly this particular gruff, stubborn old man. You could simply say you like us, Gideon. I contain multitudes. Liking people is only one of them, and I reserve the right to express it through door hinges and herb gardens rather than sentiment. Noted. Thoroughly and permanently noted. Captain Wren, who had taken to visiting the nursery preparations with the same brisk efficiency she brought to military planning, found Rosalind there one afternoon, surrounded by an increasingly overwhelming number of small blankets, cradles, and supplies that Della, the castle's formidable head of household, had been accumulating with visible, barely contained excitement. 8 of everything, Wren observed, surveying the organized chaos. I've planned military campaigns with less logistical complexity. Della's approach to preparation borders on tactical genius. I've started deferring to her judgment entirely. Wise policy. Wren settled into the chair beside her, dropping the usual military formality for something more relaxed. How are you managing, honestly? 6 months now, I understand. That's no small thing to carry, whatever wolf gestation timelines mean for the actual math of it. Some days better than others. Rosalind pressed a hand to the considerable curve of her belly, feeling the now familiar restless shifting of 8 lives crowded together beneath her ribs. My back aches constantly. I can't remember the last time I slept through an entire night without needing to shift position 4 times. And Thistle, I've named them all privately, in my head, entirely unofficially, has developed a habit of kicking directly beneath my ribs at exactly the moment I've finally found a comfortable position. Sounds exhausting. It is. Completely and thoroughly exhausting. A small, genuine smile broke through despite the complaint. It's also the most remarkable thing I've ever experienced, somehow, both things being true simultaneously. That seems to be a running theme with you, Wren observed, holding complicated, contradictory things without needing to resolve them into something simpler. I've had considerable practice this year. Oren found her there an hour later, having finally escaped an afternoon of council business that had run considerably longer than intended, his exhaustion visible but softening immediately at the sight of her surrounded by nursery preparations. You look thoroughly overwhelmed, he observed, settling beside her. I look thoroughly organized, thank you. Della has opinions about cradle placement that border on architectural theory? I don't doubt it. He reached over, resting his hand against her belly with the easy familiarity he'd developed over these past weeks, feeling the answering flutter of movement beneath his palm. How is council business, if I may ask? Considerably less interesting than I imagine your afternoon was, dressed in tiny blankets. Rennick sent his first formal report from the northern settlements, Oren said, something complicated in his expression. Genuine progress, apparently. He's overseeing reconstruction personally, working alongside the laborers rather than simply directing from a distance. The northern elder who oversees that territory sent an unsolicited note praising his diligence. That's promising. It is. I find myself still cautious about trusting it fully, but it's promising. Oren was quiet a moment, watching the gentle movement beneath his palm. I keep thinking about what you said, in the council chamber, about wanting our children to understand justice as repair rather than simple punishment. I think that philosophy is already changing how I govern, honestly, in ways I hadn't expected. Good ways, I hope. Considerably better ways. I've started listening more carefully to the reasoning underneath disputes, rather than simply ruling on the surface conflict. It's slower. It's also, I think, actually working better than the old approach did. He looked at her with something warm and slightly amazed. You've changed how I think about leadership entirely these past 2 years. I don't think I fully appreciated how much until watching you argue for Rennick's redemption rather than his exile. I contain multitudes, apparently. We've established this extensively. You certainly have. He kissed her temple, gentle and warm. 2 more months. I still can't quite believe it some days. 8 small lives, about to become entirely real rather than simply theoretical. 2 more months of this belly getting even more absurd than it already is, apparently. I look forward to every absurd month of it, Oren said, and meant it completely. The formal presentation to the full pack, not just the council, but the broader assembly of pack elders and territory representatives who governed matters of succession and legitimacy, came in the 7th month, timed carefully to establish the pups' standing before their actual birth complicated matters further. You understand, Elder Voss said, meeting privately with Rosalind and Oren the evening before the formal assembly, that 8 marked pups represent something this pack has no precedent for. The old texts speak of it only in legend. There will be questions, some hostile. I'm prepared for hostile questions, Rosalind said. I've survived considerably worse this year than skeptical elders. I don't doubt your resilience, Lady Rosalind. I simply want you prepared for the specific nature of the resistance you'll face. Some elders will question whether a litter this size represents blessing or aberration, whether it strengthens the bloodline or dilutes it beyond recognition. These are not questions asked from malice necessarily, but from genuine uncertainty about precedent that doesn't exist. Then I'll answer them honestly, Rosalind said. I don't have certainty to offer them, Elder Voss. I have 8 lives I love completely, regardless of what ancient texts speculate about their significance. That's the only answer I'm capable of giving truthfully. Elder Voss studied her a long moment, something almost approving in his usually stern expression. That may prove to be exactly the right answer, actually. The elders who matter most will respond better to honesty than to false certainty. The assembly hall, the following morning, filled with more people than Rosalind had seen gathered in one place since her earliest, most uncertain days at Kestrel Keep. Pack elders, territory representatives, curious household staff who'd found reasons to be present despite lacking any formal standing to attend. Oren spoke first, formal and measured, presenting the circumstances of the pregnancy, the pedestal's activation, the ancient sanctuary mark that had reacted so clearly to Rosalind's presence in that mountain chamber. I understand this represents uncertainty for many of you, he said, addressing the full assembly. I understand the old precedents don't account for 8 marked pups, born to a woman without traditional pack standing. I ask only that you extend the same consideration to my family that you would extend to any other member of this pack facing genuine, unprecedented circumstances. An elder near the front, older, sharp-eyed, carrying the particular weight of someone who'd survived decades of political maneuvering, rose to speak. With respect, Your Majesty, unprecedented circumstances demand more than simple consideration. They demand proof. How do we know these pups represent blessing rather than the kind of unchecked, unnatural growth the old cautionary texts warn against? Rosalind rose before Oren could answer, meeting the elder's skeptical gaze directly. You don't know, she said plainly. Not with certainty. Neither do I. I can tell you what I've witnessed these past months. A pedestal that reacted with warmth rather than harm. Pups that have grown strong and healthy despite the stress of danger and displacement. A bond between mother and litter that feels, from where I stand, like exactly the kind of thing your old texts would call blessing rather than aberration. But I won't insult this assembly by claiming false certainty I don't actually possess. The elder's expression shifted slightly, surprised by the direct honesty. What I can offer you, Rosalind continued, is this. Raise them alongside this pack, with proper oversight, proper caution, proper accountability if concerns ever prove legitimate. Don't simply exile uncertainty because it's uncomfortable. Test it carefully, the way this pack has tested every genuine unknown throughout its history. That seems like the wiser path than either blind acceptance or reflexive rejection. The assembly deliberated for the better part of 2 hours, voices rising and falling in careful debate, while Rosalind sat with Oren's hand tight around hers, exhaustion and nerves both pulling at her in equal measure. It was, unexpectedly, Elder Voss who ultimately swayed the room. "I came to this assembly prepared to argue caution bordering on outright rejection," he said, rising to address the full gathering. "I've spent this past hour listening to Lady Rosalind answer every hostile question with more honesty than most political actors offer even friendly ones. I've watched her refuse false certainty in favor of genuine, careful truth. That's not the behavior of someone hiding something dangerous. That's the behavior of someone genuinely, carefully trying to navigate the unknown responsibly." He looked around the assembled elders. "I move that we extend provisional acceptance, with the oversight and accountability Lady Rosalind herself proposed. Test the unknown carefully, as she suggests, rather than rejecting it out of simple discomfort." The vote, when finally called, passed with considerably more support than Rosalind had dared hope for. Provisional acceptance, formal oversight, and, notably, formal recognition of the litter's legitimate claim to succession pending their safe birth and early development. "You did that," Oren murmured, once the assembly had begun to disperse, relief evident in every line of his exhausted face. "Turned an entire skeptical council toward genuine acceptance through nothing but stubborn honesty." "I contain multitudes," Rosalind said, though her voice shook slightly with the release of tension the past 2 hours had demanded. Apparently, that includes surviving hostile political assemblies while 7 months pregnant with 8 increasingly restless pups. "You're remarkable, Rosalind. Genuinely, completely remarkable." "I'm exhausted mostly. Remarkable can wait until after I've had considerable rest, and possibly an entire meal eaten without interruption." That evening, with the formal assembly's tension finally behind them, Gideon found Rosalind resting in the garden he'd started cultivating, watching the last light of day settle gold over the herb beds he'd insisted served purely scientific purposes. "You did well today," he said, settling beside her with his usual gruff economy of praise. "I nearly fell apart twice, honestly. That elder's questions cut close to fears I hadn't fully admitted having myself." "That's precisely why it mattered that you answered them honestly, rather than performing false confidence. People recognize genuine uncertainty handled with courage. It's considerably more persuasive than false certainty ever manages to be." Gideon glanced at her belly, something unexpectedly soft in his weathered expression. "1 more month near enough before we meet these 8 troublemakers properly." 1 more month. Rosalind pressed both hands to the considerable weight of her belly, feeling the now constant restless movement beneath her palms. "I still can't quite believe it some days. After everything, the flight through the forest, the mountain chamber, Rennick's confession, today's assembly, we're actually going to meet them soon. Properly. All 8 of them. You've earned that meeting, girl. Through more difficulty than most mothers face carrying a single pup, let alone 8. Gideon's voice had gone rougher than usual, something genuinely moved beneath the gruffness. "I'm proud to have played whatever small part I did in getting you here safely." "Small part," Rosalind repeated, incredulous. "Gideon, you broke down an ancient magical door with a hammer and then sheltered a hunted, pregnant stranger in your secret mountain home without a single moment's hesitation. That's not a small part. That's the reason any of us survived that first night at all." Gideon cleared his throat gruffly, clearly uncomfortable with direct sentiment, despite having earned every word of it. "Well, I contain multitudes, apparently. Sentiments evidently one of them, however reluctantly expressed." Rosalind laughed, warm and genuine, and rested her head against his shoulder, watching the garden settle into evening shadow. 1 month remaining, 8 lives waiting patiently beneath her heart, and a family gathered from the most unlikely circumstances imaginable, finally, fully ready to welcome them home. The final month passed in a strange, suspended kind of waiting, Rosalind's belly grown to a size that made even Gideon occasionally pause mid-sentence to stare. Della's nursery preparations reaching a level of organization that bordered on military precision, and Oren finding increasingly flimsy excuses to abandon council business early in favor of simply sitting beside her, one hand resting against the constant, restless movement beneath her ribs. "You have an entire kingdom to run," Rosalind pointed out, watching him settle beside her for the third time that day, a stack of abandoned correspondence still clutched in one hand. "The kingdom will survive my absence for an afternoon. I'm not entirely convinced I'll survive missing whatever happens if I'm not here when they finally arrive." "They're not arriving this exact afternoon, Oren. Gideon says at least another week, based on how they've been settling." Gideon's been remarkably precise about wolf gestation timelines for a man who spent 50 years alone in a mountain. Gideon has delivered more litters than most trained midwives see in a lifetime, apparently. I've stopped questioning his expertise on the matter. She shifted, trying to find a position that didn't immediately provoke a fresh round of restless kicking. Though I confess I'll be relieved when his expertise is no longer merely theoretical. Word arrived from the Northern Territories that same week, a formal letter from Rennick, considerably longer than his usual brief reports, detailing not just the reconstruction progress, but something more personal underneath the formal language. I find myself, for the first time in longer than I can properly remember, doing work that feels genuinely mine, rather than work performed in resentful comparison to what I believed I was owed. The northern settlements are rebuilding steadily. I am rebuilding alongside them, in ways I did not expect this assignment to require of me. I understand I have not yet earned back trust, and I do not expect these reports alone to accomplish that. I only wanted you both to know that whatever I nearly destroyed, I am spending every day trying, in whatever small ways available to me, to build something worth the chance you extended. Please give Lady Rosalind my continued gratitude when the pups arrive. I understand from Elder Voss's own report that her testimony before the full assembly proved decisive in securing their acceptance. I do not think I properly thanked her for defending something I once tried to destroy. He's changing, Oren said quietly, reading the letter a second time. Genuinely, I think. People generally do, given real chances and real work to prove it with, Rosalind said. I'm glad you extended him that chance, whatever the council initially wanted instead. I extended it because you argued for it. I'm not certain I'd have found my way there alone. You'd have found your way eventually. I simply helped you find it faster. It was on a quiet evening, nearly a full week later, that Rosalind felt the first true, unmistakable signs that Gideon's careful predictions had finally proven accurate. Not the ordinary restless shifting she'd grown accustomed to, but something deeper, more insistent, a pressure building steadily through her lower back that made her set down the book she'd been only half reading and go very still. Gideon, she called, keeping her voice remarkably steady given the circumstances. He was there within moments, weathered face immediately shifting into the same practical, focused competence he'd shown that very first night in the mountain chamber. How long have you been feeling this? An hour, maybe. I thought it was ordinary discomfort until it started coming with actual rhythm. That'll do it then. Gideon was already moving, calling for Della, for the household physician, for Oren, who arrived breathless within minutes, having abandoned whatever council business had briefly separated them. You're certain, Oren said, kneeling beside her, some careful mixture of terror and excitement warring visibly across his face. Reasonably certain. 8 lives don't generally announce their timing quietly. What followed was, by any fair account, hours of careful, exhausting work. Della and the household physician moving with practiced competence, Gideon hovering nearby with the particular anxious usefulness of a man who'd delivered countless litters but had never before felt quite this personally invested in the outcome, and Oren remaining close throughout, steady and present in every way that mattered, offering whatever quiet strength Rosalind needed through each difficult hour. There was worry, certainly. 8 lives arriving safely required considerable care, considerable patience, and more than a little of the same stubborn determination that had carried Rosalind through 6 days of frozen forest and hidden mountain chambers months earlier. But there was none of the acute danger that had haunted so much of the year before it, only the demanding, exhausting, entirely worthwhile work of new life, finally arriving into a world that had, against considerable odds, made proper space to welcome them. By the time dawn broke soft and gold over Kestrel Keep's eastern towers, 8 small, healthy pups lay settled against Rosalind's side, and she herself, utterly exhausted but deeply, completely peaceful, felt Oren's hand find hers with a tenderness that needed no further words at all. 8, Gideon said, arriving to witness the aftermath, his usual gruffness entirely abandoned in favor of open, unguarded wonder. 8 healthy pups, after everything that tried to prevent this exact moment from happening. I've delivered a great many litters in my time, girl. None of them mattered to me quite like this one. You helped make sure we survived long enough to reach it, Rosalind said softly. That matters more than you'll ever properly let yourself admit, I suspect. Sentiment again. I contain multitudes, apparently, whether I choose to or not. Word spread through the keep and beyond with remarkable speed. The formal assembly's provisional acceptance suddenly made real and undeniable 8 small lives who represented whatever the ancient texts ultimately proved to mean, something the pack elders would need to properly reckon with in the years ahead. Elder Voss himself visited within the week, examining the pups with the same careful, skeptical attention he'd brought to the assembly months earlier, though something in his stern expression had visibly softened by the time he finished his assessment. They're strong, he said finally. Remarkably so, for a litter this size. Whatever concerns I carried about aberration versus blessing, I find myself considerably more inclined toward the latter interpretation, watching them now. I appreciate your honesty in reconsidering, Rosalind said, both the original skepticism and the willingness to update it. I've found over many years serving this council that genuine wisdom requires exactly that willingness. Rigid certainty in either direction rarely serves a pack well in matters this unprecedented. Elder Voss studied her a long moment. You handled uncertainty with more grace than most political actors twice your experience, Lady Rosalind. This pack is fortunate to have you within it, whatever hesitation I once carried about the circumstances. Rennick's letter arrived 3 days after the pup's birth, considerably more emotional than his previous careful reports. I understand they've arrived safely. I cannot properly express how relieved I am to hear it, given how thoroughly I once threatened that exact outcome. I have no right to ask this, but I find myself hoping that someday, once trust has been properly rebuilt through years rather than mere months, I might be permitted to meet them, not as their uncle in any formal sense I've earned yet, but simply as someone who wants, very much, to become someone worth that title eventually. Oren read the letter aloud, something complicated but genuinely warm in his expression by the time he finished. What do you think? He asked. I think people deserve the chance to become better than their worst moment, provided they're willing to do the actual work of earning it, Rosalind said. He's been doing that work for months now, consistently, without expectation of quick reward. I think, eventually, that chance should be extended properly. Not yet, but eventually. You're remarkably generous, even now. I contain multitudes, Oren. We've established this extensively, and apparently it extends to complicated family reconciliation as thoroughly as it extends to everything else. A year later, Kestrel Keep had settled into a rhythm none of them could have properly imagined during those desperate frozen days of flight and hiding. 8 small wolves growing steadily into distinct, increasingly boisterous personalities, each carrying some echo of the courage and stubbornness that had carried their mother through the worst night of her life. Thistle, true to his early restlessness, had grown into the litter's most persistent troublemaker, first into every mischief and considerably too fond of stealing food directly from Della's kitchen, despite her increasingly creative attempts at prevention. Gideon remained at Kestrel Keep permanently now, his herb garden thriving, his door hinge repairs extending, somehow, to nearly every door in the castle whether they required it or not, and his gruff, reluctant affection for all 8 pups evident in the way they gravitated toward him constantly, treating his workshop as a second home. Rennick's supervised service in the Northern Territories continued steadily, his formal reports gradually softening from careful professional distance into something closer to genuine, hopeful connection. He had visited once, cautiously, 3 months after the pup's birth, a careful formal meeting that had ended unexpectedly with Thistle climbing directly into his lap and falling promptly asleep, an act of pure trusting innocence that had left Rennick visibly, uncharacteristically undone. "I don't deserve that," he'd said quietly, watching the small pup sleep against him. "Perhaps not yet," Rosalind had told him. "But he's decided anyway. Children have a way of extending trust before it's fully earned. Try to become someone worthy of what he's already given you freely." The Eastern Territories had rebuilt fully under his oversight by the pup's first birthday, and Elder Voss's most recent formal review had noted, with visible surprise, genuine and sustained transformation rather than temporary performance. Rosalind and Oren married properly the following spring, not the hurried, uncertain arrangement their earlier years together had sometimes felt like navigating council disapproval and Rennick's quiet resentment, but a genuine, joyful celebration attended by a pack that had, slowly and imperfectly, come to embrace exactly what 8 marked pups actually represented. Not aberration, not simple blessing either, but something more complicated and more true than either label. Proof that unprecedented things, met with courage and honesty rather than fear, could become exactly the strength a struggling territory most needed. Standing in the castle gardens that evening, watching 8 small wolves tumble through early spring grass while Gideon pretended not to watch them with open, undisguised fondness, Rosalind felt Oren's hand find hers, warm and certain. "2 years ago," she said quietly, "I was running through a frozen forest with nothing but the clothes on my back and 8 small hopes I wasn't certain would survive the night. And now? Now I have all of this. A husband who searched 6 days without rest. A hermit who broke down an ancient door with nothing but stubborn kindness. A brother-in-law slowly rebuilding himself into someone worth knowing. And 8 children who somehow, against every reasonable expectation, turned out to be exactly the blessing that ancient Mark once promised. I contain multitudes," Oren said, echoing her own favorite phrase with a warm, teasing smile. "You've been spending too much time around Gideon. I've been spending my whole life around remarkable people who taught me that complicated things deserve honest attention rather than easy answers. I consider myself fortunate for every one of those lessons." The evening settled gold and peaceful around them, 8 small lives tumbling happily through grass that had, once, belonged only to careful ceremony and cold political calculation, now belonging, fully and completely, to a family built from courage, stubborn kindness, and the simple, hard-won understanding that home is rarely found where you expect it, but always worth the difficult journey required to reach it. If this story found its way into your heart, the frozen forest, the mountain chamber, the assembly hall where honesty won what certainty couldn't, I'd love to hear which part stayed with you. And if you're hungry for another tale of stubborn courage and families built from unlikely beginnings, just say the word.